You're on.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm Patrick Bowersock, Secretary of the Wake LP. Thanks. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight to our speaking event. We have Jon Sanders from the John Locke Foundation. He'll be talking about regulation and harm it can affect things. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mr. Jon Sanders.
Thanks for the invitation, Patrick. Thanks for the Wake County Libertarian Party having me here. It's actually good to see some faces that I know, like Barbara, who was the first Libertarian candidate I ever voted for. I would do it again. I would do it again. You know, I was thinking about it. I didn't even know Libertarian until I had gone to college. I was working in a conservative student publication, like an independent little publication put together. And one of the students there was nicknamed the Token Libertarian. That was his column title, Token Libertarian. And I wasn't a Libertarian at the time. I consider myself sort of a small L. Well, I'll get into that in a second. But I always thought he was intriguing. I thought he was a little odd, a little bit too pure. But, you know, graduated, went out and started working, eventually got a job at the Locke Foundation. I'm one of the longest, my name is Jon Sanders. I am a regulatory policy analyst now at the John Locke Foundation. But years ago, I came in, I'm one of the longest serving members of the Locke Foundation. And I don't know if any of you remember Catherine Parker, but she was a really good friend of mine. And she was a very good influence on me and finally pushed me over. I was talking with Bruce earlier about the interesting debates that libertarians get into and how can you translate that into policy? How do you not run people off with the minutia that sometimes the debates get into? And on a side note, sort of along those lines, I've always worried about the whole term. The term libertarian sometimes doesn't seem to tell people very much. Conservatives don't quite know what to do with it. Liberals think they ought to be statists who like marijuana. So the last thing that, and you can't call yourself a classical liberal, even though that is the most descriptive term available, liberal, but it doesn't mean what it used to mean. So my colleague Roy Cardado wrote a column about the use of coercion in modern day liberalism, and I've decided to start calling myself a liberal who is opposed to coercion. I think that gets it across, because if you're a liberal, you can't go very far. When I mean liberal, the modern day meaning of the term, you can't get too far without saying, oh, well, I really, really need coercion. So what does it mean to be a liberal without coercion? Well, my topic tonight is going to be occupational licensing. I've done a lot of work in that area this year. It's one of the areas where the government is really involved the most in people's lives. It's grown quite a bit over the last century. First of all, occupational licensing essentially is entry regulations by the government for someone to get into his or her field of labor, what they want to do for a living. If it happens to be a licensed area, they have to satisfy everything, all the hoops the government wants them to jump through. They have to be able to satisfy an occupational licensing board's number of class hours, which requires tuition, a lot of time and money spent. They might have to satisfy tests. Sometimes certain licenses require several tests they have to pass. They may have to fulfill the certain amount of apprenticeship hours, or in some of the most egregious ways, they may have to prove to the board that they're a person of good character, which is a very nebulous standard that they have to meet. It's not only a criminal background check, but it could be even a little bit more. But as an economist, I find those things extremely worrisome, because even going back to Adam Smith, he pointed out that the very first property that people have, and the way of attaining all their other property, the foundation of them getting property, is their labor. And he wrote that in The Wealth of Nations. And then when I read economists like Milton Friedman or Simon Kuznets or Morris Kleiner, who have written and researched in occupational licensing, they all come back to it. This is like a medieval guild, which is the sort of thing that Adam Smith was writing about. In Capitalism and Freedom, his seminal work, Milton Friedman wrote about occupational licensing, and he led with discussions of the medieval guild. And he said getting rid of the medieval guild was one of the signature moments of human liberty in Western civilization. So naturally, he saw that this increasing growth in licensure as a step backwards for human liberty. So how has it grown? Well, for example, in 1952, the Council of State Governments had released a report, and they were alarmed. They said they were alarmed by the growth in state licensing. At the time, there were 75 different occupations that were under licensure, 14 that were shared by all 50 states. That was in 52. In 2004, they re-upped the study, and at that point in time, they found over 1,100 different occupations licensed across the states, only 60 of which, a little over 5%, were licensed in all the states. That meant that almost 95% were not. And there was considerable question among the states whether this is the sort of thing they should be under license. In North Carolina, I read also in Friedman's book, in Friedman's chapter, there was an economist named Walter Geldhorn who read that in 1938, North Carolina had 60 licenses. Now, according to the Commerce Department, we're up to 188. And in on the back of one of the pages that I've handed out is the growth in the licensing boards over time in North Carolina. Understand that the licensing boards, several of them will have many licenses attached to them. It's not a one-to-one. There's a board for every license. There's a board that may be in control of many licenses. So why is this so? Why have we seen such a great increase in the state getting involved in your first freedom and your first aspect of getting property? And for North Carolina, I think it's even more important, because in our state constitution, we recognize in language that reflects the Declaration of Independence, we recognize a self-evident, inalienable right to a person to the enjoyment of the fruits of their own labor. So in my way of thinking, that means there really should be a serious reason for the government to get involved in entry regulations of that sort. The reason being that everyone seems to think is safety and quality. We need, as a state, to make sure that providers are knowledgeable enough that they're providing safe and quality work so that people aren't getting taken advantage of. The problem is the research on that is not really bearing it out. The economic research into the safety and quality effects of licensing is very mixed. Sometimes it will seem to support it. A lot of times it's not. The one thing that is crystal clear in economic research about occupational licensing is that these entry regulations limit the supply of competitors And because of that, it's raising prices. And it also is raising prices on consumers, and therefore raising earnings on those who are in the licensed profession. The average is about 15% higher earnings over a lifetime if you're a service provider in a licensed profession than otherwise. But if it's not raising safety and quality, what's going on there? We've seen some counterintuitive results in literature, and I've posted these on our website at johnlocke.org, the locker room. And for example, states that have stricter electricians licensing tend to have greater electrocution rates. States that have stricter licensing of veterinarians tend to have greater rates of rabies. States that have stricter licensing of optometrists tend to have greater rates of blindness. These seem very counterintuitive. The most recent one I saw is that if you have stricter regulation of private security, there is greater property crime. What's happening, I believe, is the licensing is a process. It's a way of checking on the process, but these other things are outcomes. So it's very possible that the licensed providers are providing better quality work, but there are fewer of them. And it's also cutting out the aspect that someone that wants to provide work in this field may be seeking the kind of things and jumping through the kind of hoops voluntarily that the licensure would provide. So in speaking to a libertarian, especially, but I make this case anyway, what aspects of there, what is there for people who are consumers, people who are providers, and then the people who are in government? What do they have that involve licensing? Well, first of all, private voluntary certification. I think it's very interesting that there's even certain organizations. I wrote it down. I was going to be responsible in, but yeah, the National Organization for Competency Assurance, the American Standards Institute, they will both come and check your certifying organization to make sure you're certifying what you say you're certifying, which is a great private market response to an obvious need. If you are a provider and you want to make sure that consumers know they can trust you, you're going to seek out certification. You're going to make sure you've got these credentials that you can advertise. If you're a mechanic and you want to be trusted, you're going to be National Institute for Automotive, I can't remember exactly the whole name of it, but I can remember it because I wrote it down. National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence. Several, in most service professions, will have a certifying organization. Outside of that, there are review organizations, there are quality assurance organizations. There's the Better Business Bureau, for example. There is Better Homes and Gardens. There's Consumer Reports. We have more recourse now than ever before to find out who's good and who's bad, who to do business with and who to avoid than ever before. And this is something that's being done privately by people who are selling a reputation, selling a service, because there's an obvious market need for it. But beyond that, there are other ways. Word of mouth is a huge one. If you have a good experience or a bad experience with somebody, you're going to tell people about it. People trust that. Groups like Angie's List, you can check out these services like that. Social media, Facebook, Twitter, Yelp. You can share your results that way. I'll show you an interesting example that I had in my life. 3 years ago, I went to Savannah. My wife has always wanted to go to Savannah. I was there for a conference. I was able to take her there. So we had one night. I had one night in Savannah to take her to a nice restaurant, and I wanted to get this exactly right. So I got on Yelp, and I went looking through, looked at the reviews, wanted to pick out the exact right one. One restaurant, and I can't remember the exact name of it. I think it had crocodile in the name of it, but anyway. One restaurant sounded really good, and everything was good for it except for the most recent review was extremely negative, and the guy said that the chef quit, and it was a horrible night, and they kicked everybody out. And I thought, well, I don't want to do anything with that. But it was so unlike all the other reviews, and this is something you can do with Yelp that's even better than just your regular word of mouth review. I looked to see what else that reviewer said. He was negative across the board. Everything that he reviewed, he had something nasty to say. And in the poking around, I found a response from the restaurant. And the restaurant said, as we basically said, as we explained to you that night, our chef had a serious accident in the kitchen. We had to close the kitchen down. We had to take him to the hospital because we take care of our people here. So instead of having a bad thought about that restaurant, I came away feeling much better about their service and much better about their management. And that's something that I couldn't have even got if I just heard this from a man on the street. So these are voluntary things that people, consumers, that service providers can do. What about government? What's the role of government? Well, one, the major role of government is to protect that first primary right, that first primary property right, foundation of all property. That fundamental, self-evident right of all North Carolinians. It's not going to be recognized anywhere else. So first is to make sure to keep the market free as best as possible. That doesn't mean there's no role, because the government is still there to deal with if you have a negative experience, if you have an actionable experience, you can sue. You can have a tort action. But let's say there's something more. Say, and this is where I like, and I put this on the back, I think it's on the very back sheet, the policy pyramid from the Institute for Justice. It looks at a bunch of different ways that government can respond that doesn't involve the entry regulation preventing someone from getting into their work before satisfying all the government hoops. So you could, for example, if you're worried about fraud, you could strengthen the Deceptive Practices Act, make that more clear. Give the Attorney General power to go after people who are defrauding people. What if you're worried about cleanliness? Well, if that's the worry, then require some more inspections. Or if you're worried about third-party harm and externalities, then you require more bonding and insurance. Or if you're worried about an asymmetrical information, such as mechanics who are not licensed in this state. If you're worried, asymmetrical information would be where a consumer could not possibly have enough knowledge beforehand to tell whether or not they're getting good service. Or if it's a matter of insurance payments, then you have the state recognize certification. And that way, you would take care of that concern. Only in the most extreme examples, and for most people this would get to be like medical or some other things, would you actually go to the policy extreme of licensing. In my capacity at John Locke, where I'm trying to push freedom for North Carolinians, for individuals in North Carolina, I will admit I'm not going all the way like Milton Friedman, who is one of my personal heroes, will do, which is he went to the Mayo Clinic and said, we got to get rid of medical licenses, and here's why. I'll acknowledge that that probably is going to be a non-starter with people that I'm trying to push. But for the rest of it, I think it's a very, very important approach. First, do no harm, and then only so far as necessary to keep the field as free as possible. I've been kind of rambling in this, so at this point, I'll be willing to take your questions, and I thank you for your patience in listening and hear me out.
So what's your number?
What's my number?
Yeah, it's less than 60, I guess, right? How many occupations
That's
in
a
North
good
Carolina?
question, and that's why I can't answer that. I want to leave it up for public debate because it needs to be up for public debate. But it would be considerably less than 60. I would say a handful.
So, any low-hanging fruit, is there any occupational licensing that's right for being illegal?
There are several.
Repeat the question, please.
Yes, I'm sorry. The question is there any low-hanging fruit licenses that obviously need to be removed? There are several. The Program Evaluation Division and the State Auditor both have several listed in their reports that have problems for one reason or another, and that have very few people who are listed. Of course, I can't think of very many off the top of my head, but there's some like counseling, there's some like, there's some trades. But it's not going to be, we don't have some that stick out like other states. Like there's a potato shipper's license in Nebraska and Michigan. And you actually have to have a license to ship potatoes.
In California, they recently required you to have a license to be an interior decorator.
In California, there's a license for interior decorating. You know what's interesting? There is an interior decorator's license in Washington, D.C. But when President Barack Obama came into town, he hired a celebrity interior decorator who was not licensed to have the White House decorated. And of course, he did a wonderful, fantastic job, which only goes to show. I remember several years ago, and I can't remember the state. I want to say it was Florida, but I can't remember. There was an anecdote about an interior decorators lobbying group making a presentation to the state on why there needs to be lobbying for interior decorators. And they showed them a video of a baby doll crawling and hitting blinds, and the blinds fall and land on the baby. I forget everything, but if memory serves, it ends up with the house catching fire.
Was it bad interior decorating?
Yeah, bad interior decorating. You're next.
Yeah, so you had said there's 189 licenses in North Carolina currently. Is that correct? Because I thought it was like closer to like 700.
Okay, so you're asking about where there are 188 licenses versus 700. If the professions licensed, according to the Commerce Department, are 188, but there are over 700 and some, like 704 different tasks that are licensed.
Okay.
So yeah,
Okay.
so you were correct.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Hair braiding would absolutely be an example of low-hanging fruit. He asked if hair braiding would be an example of low-hanging fruit. Did you hear the news today out of Tennessee? Institute for Justice released a press release today that this hair braider was hit with over $100,000 worth of fines for employing unlicensed hair braiders. And this is something that this person apparently had been doing since she was 3 years old. Other questions?
Hair braiders isn't in North Carolina, though. That's Tennessee and other states.
No, we do it here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
But that's not a.
Yeah.
That's a food safety issue.
There's
right?
anecdote
So they
about
expect to affect that place.
someone who owns a restaurant braiding hair on the side. Yeah. In North Carolina, you need 300 hours of coursework to get a license for braiding hair. There are several states that don't require a license at all. South Carolina, I think, only requires 3 hours. Some states require 100. North Carolina requires 300.
Is it 300 hours of hair braiding or 300 hours of cosmetic? Why do they accept it?
Right, 300 hours of coursework, of training. Yeah. I'm not sure how much of it, but it doesn't seem like much of it would deal with hair braiding. It's worse for some states. I forget which is which. Some of them go to 600. There's some that have 1,000 hours. And one, I want to say it was South Dakota, but it might have been North Dakota, requires like 2,100.
But I guess to her point, the quick rebut, I mean, what would you go with? I mean, would you just go, look, you just, at this point, you do a Yelp review and you just say, look, it's nasty to be touching hair and food, have that happening in the same environment, give them for a Yelp review and let that stand, or? Right? I mean,
Yeah, I would be saying exactly. I don't know about, don't know if I'd want to eat there. She's touching people's hair while she's serving food. It would be, yeah.
That's a 10-second answer.
Walking out loudly.
I don't
Yes.
think it would impact our hair braiding license, though, right?
I stopped practicing and I keep my law skills. I do all that. And I have a professional service license. It's like 50 hours. And I decided the first year, I'm not going to pay because I'm no longer practicing. And they had me to death. And so I just.
So you have a law license and you let it go? Or are you still licensed? Still licensed, okay. Yeah.
But I took for my law services, I had to add a certificate.
Oh, okay, so it's a law service license on top of it, a certificate on top of it.
And it's like a clap. I can't get rid of it.
I'm not repeating that part.
But they will count it. There's no way to say they're actively practicing. And it's not worth the effort. You know, to pay.
So basically, he's being hectored by the law, by the Department of Revenue, not the bar? Okay.
But it has to license it all.
I guess it's a little worrisome that they're that much in need of $50.
Yes, it is.
Anyway, I don't have an answer for that.
But then that's the sort of thing where it's like, they say they will garnish 10% or whatever. It's very onerous. It's just like, all right, you got it.
Yeah, so there's no cost to them to send you a threatening letter or a threatening email. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Now, I know this isn't weird, but Connecticut, my barber had to shut down his shop because they were making him get a cosmetology license, essentially for everything. It's like, this is just a standard barber shop. Like, most of the people just come in, they want their haircut, that's it. Not here to shampoo people or do hair color and stuff. Apparently, the state was making him get a cosmetology license to get certified for all these things he doesn't do in the barber shop.
So apparently in Connecticut,
Yeah.
if you're a barber now, you have to have a cosmetology license. That's really interesting. Those are two of the strongest licensing boards generally in a state. So I'm surprised that Connecticut's cosmetology board is that strong, much stronger than their barbers. And yeah, I would imagine it's shut down a lot of barbers.
Oh yeah, there's not too many of them left anymore. They're like, we're not here to, we're just here to cut traditional barbershop. Cut hair, get a shave, that's it.
Yeah, I'm surprised by that. Yes.
So a present issue, going on in North Carolina regarding optometrists and ophthalmologists who can let a computer do eye correction operation. There's a heated debate and a lot of money involved. So every time it comes to committee, you see lots of commercials, a lot of advertising get pumped. Every North Carolinian is going to go blind if we let your optometrist do this. What is a comfortable response that you would see?
So optometry versus ophthalmology and eye exams.
It's for LASIK.
For LASIK,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, what's a comfortable response? Comfortable is an interesting word.
There are the argument that's being made by those who want that protected status is that if anyone other than a licensed surgeon does this procedure, which is run by computers, and you'll go blind.
So the concern is you'll go blind unless you're run by a licensed, yeah, by a licensed surgeon. Without having really looked into that particular issue, I'll just say it strikes me a lot like the teeth whitening. Or maybe it could be along the lines of nurse practitioners versus physicians, and who can provide early medical care. And in those cases, barring strong evidence against it, I don't see why they can't.
The purpose of my question that you'll find in a very passionate libertarian crowd, we of course find that to be absurd. And that if you as a consumer are concerned, that you can go to the higher license.
Right.
It's your choice.
Well, this gets back to what he just said, was that, you know, if you're concerned, you can go to the higher licensed provider or the higher certified provider. This gets back to what I said earlier about electricians' licenses leading to more electrocution deaths. Veterinarians, what happens is in those fields, the licensure is stricter, and it has a greater depressive effect on suppliers, which makes their prices higher, which has an economic impact on especially poor consumers. And they start thinking, I don't know if I want to spend the money on a licensed electrician. I could probably do it myself, or my neighbor says he can do it, or my father-in-law is going to come over and do it. And so there's a greater risk of adverse impacts from moving to that sort of thing. For rabies, for example, the research found that the fewer veterinarians there were fewer people with a professional eye to notice when there was an epidemic starting, or, you know, maybe not epidemic, but location of certain cases showing up so that they could get in front of it faster, that authorities could get in front of it faster. And the same thing with blindness, the same thing with negative dental results, or with property crimes when there's greater licensing and stricter licensing of security guards. Because there are more of them, they cost more, and people decide, well, we'll go it on our own, or we just can't afford it. So that's what happens.
Anyone ever done a study of how much money is actually generated by all these licenses? The states collect millions, tens of millions, millions.
In fairness,
Repeat the
no,
question,
it's not. Oh, the question, thank you, sorry. The question is, has anyone done a study of how much money is generated by licensing fees? At least in North Carolina, it's not really a money-making operation for the state. The fees that go to support the board. So I don't know what the cost in fees how that adds up nationally. I'm sure that there's a study out there like that. I will say that the overall cost of licensing and opportunity costs and everything is in the hundreds of billions.
Another question. Those students go pay for the board. Are the fees at least paying for the board, or are we paying the opportunity cost and then having to pay in the cost of the make the difference to funding fires?
Well, and that's he was asking if the fees actually do pay for the boards. One of the things that the state auditor study found was that some boards weren't paying for themselves. Of course, there's two different responses. My response would be, well, if they can't even earn their keep, why are they even bothering? We don't need it. But the other response is, well, we just need to raise fees. Yes.
So you mentioned that our license, what do you think people in that position this license?
So the question is, if people in the licensed profession earn 15% more lifetime than they otherwise would, do they have incentive to lobby for regulation? And that is definitely a finding in the literature. A fairly common finding in the literature is that this incentive, this public choice problem exists. And it's a standard problem anyway. The regulated people in the regulated field, or people in the field, want the government to regulate them because then it gives them greater chance to capture rents. Yes.
Follow up on your question over there about topics you brought in. What's the least expensive license and the most expensive license? Do you have any information on that?
Least expensive, most expensive license, I do not know. I would say in North Carolina that the construction trades license is not near as expensive here as it is in many others. I saw that in data from Institute for Justice and their license to work report. But I don't know if that counts as least expensive. I don't think so.
I'll make more of a point than a question, especially since a couple people work in IT, like Brian and Monty, Beth. Merrill Lynch, BB&T, Secure Government Network, touch them all, no license. So if you want to talk about an industry that makes billions of dollars here in Research Triangle Park, it's IT. And it moves too fast to be licensed. I mean, that's one of the advantages of IT. I don't, Brian, you don't have a license, right, from the state for what you do?
Right.
Monty does it. You may have private vendor certifications, but that's an example that I remember from 2016 gained some traction. Is we don't have government licenses, and yet I touch networks where all your money's at, touch secure government networks in a war zone. No license. So to your point, it does work. And when you make that point to a bunch of realtors who just sell houses, it does gain a little bit of, you get through that skull a little bit.
That's a really good point. What he mentioned is that IT moves too fast to license, and so they are not licensed, and yet that is a very lucrative field to be in, and then touches a lot of private sensitive data. Can they capture that fairly?
Pretty much.
And is it what?
And we have a lot of certification bodies.
Right. Yes, I forgot to mention. Yes, a lot of certification.
Which are also not entirely highly respected within some parts of our industry, but different story.
And it would have to be one where there's an asymmetrical information problem. I know next to absolutely nothing regarding those kind of issues. I mean, might know how to troubleshoot a couple of things, but that'd be it. In the back, yeah.
Talk a lot about the cost of licenses, whether they're too expensive, what most expensive. So when you say that the real cost is in, when you constrain the market, price goes up for those services, and essentially you're draining money out of the economy instead of in use better use. So the true cost of a strict licensing regime is in the overall economic impact.
Yeah. So his question is, would I say if the cost is not just in terms of paying for the license, but in the cost to the society of prices going up and time being wasted and maybe people being turned away. Yeah, there's a lot of deadweight loss in terms of licensing. That's when, if you know the economic term, a deadweight loss is expending time and resources, but getting nothing in return. Absolutely. Yeah, taxes. Not in this state. It is something that I wouldn't mind.
Question, please.
Yeah, I apologize. I did it again. The question is there a trade where you can either have a license or practice under certification? And the answer is not in this state. It is something that I've suggested. I think it would be almost a poison pill against official state licensure if you were to have a certification system operating adjacent to it, where the state would have to defend your certification, right to title of certified professional, whatever. But I think it would be great because sometimes the idea that license is hard for people to give up, even if they recognize that the certification is important and safe. There's a comfort to consumers in knowing that there's a license in that field. So I wouldn't mind seeing a competition in a way between certified providers and licensed providers and let consumers choose. That's a good question.
So can you?
So in your state, it was in Georgia, union work was certified. Okay. So greater quality certification via the union versus non-union professionals in that field. Okay. Okay. Right. Yeah, so competition when there's voluntary unionization. Yeah. One of the interesting things that Morris Kleiner, who's done the most research in occupational licensing, has found that as licensing has grown, unionization has decreased, but there's a greater perception of quality among licensed professionals and consumers in their perception of licensed professionals of quality as opposed to unions, people who are in the unions and people who are dealing with unions when it's really essentially involuntarily. So the perception of quality in those fields go up as it moved from unionization to licensing. How would it compare moving from a right to work state to a union state? Oh, compare his situation to a right to work state. Right. It would just depend. I'm not quite sure how to answer that other than that. It would depend.
So can you talk about licensing reciprocity and some of the issues with that? Like, for example, North Carolina school teachers, someone comes from out of state, they have to recertify and relicense in our state to teach here.
Yeah, reciprocity in other states, that can be a very big issue, limiting mobility. And it just depends. I was speaking to a podiatrist who is stationed, he was in New Jersey.
Might as well be stationed.
Yeah. He has a lot of customers that have come to North Carolina who want to do telemedicine with him, but he cannot get a license because there is a very slight difference in the training hours required to get a license in New Jersey versus North Carolina. However, he's board certified, but that doesn't count to the North Carolina Licensing Board. So he's been talking to me for a couple of years now, trying to figure out what he's going to do. And I feel for the guy. He doesn't want to, the last I talked to him anyway, he doesn't want to sue, but it may come to that. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So Michael would like to, whoops, see, I got you trapped there. We'll change. So Michael would like you to have this for your car or office. When you see a special interest lobbyist who's defending one of these licensing boards, go ahead and put that on the back of their car. They'll appreciate that. I'm guessing you're a medium. Okay, fantastic. Well, I appreciate you coming out. This was. Oh, really? Okay, I did not know that. But no, fantastic. Appreciate the conversation. I mean, occupational licensing affects a lot of people, impacts a lot of people. It's one of the issues that, you know, we're talking about in the county at least and trying to draw attention to. So we appreciate you coming out. So thank you again. All right. Now this is also Good News Wednesday, so I have some other things to mention. On our Facebook page tomorrow, we'll have information on the Wake Libertarian Convention on 4 April. And we'll actually have some free food. So it'll be here, 7 p.m., but we'll have some free food, which will be fantastic. The state chair has demanded cake. So let them eat cake, and Patrick has taken that to heart, and we will have cake because Susan demands cake. Some other quick thank yous. Ken has stepped up and is using right now a very nice new Nikon camera that he has purchased. It's his, but he's really purchased it for us, along with a audio recording system that can pair with it and also be used with iPhone. So if you're a candidate or have something you want to record or use, you can get with Ken. So round of applause for Ken for buying a camera that costs too much money. And I do want to acknowledge we have been recruiting treasurers very actively. All these candidates need somebody to count the money, and some of you have stepped up, like Trey, and I appreciate that. And I also want to give a round of thanks to Brad, because I looked at the spreadsheet the other day and realized that Brad is a, quote, interim treasurer for quite a number of people. And I suspect a few of those will become permanent, perhaps, I don't know. But yeah, look, it doesn't happen unless somebody owns that. So, you know, I appreciate a round of applause for Brad for stepping up and counting the money and keeping us honest, because we have quite a few people who sometimes get in trouble. And finally, we have been graced with the presence of Barbara Howe, who received an almost unanimous endorsement from the Durham Orange Libertarian. There's always that guy. So anyway, it was unanimous in Durham. And the Wake County Libertarian Party has also endorsed Barbara Howe for U.S. Congressional District 4. Barbara, did you have anything you wanted to say to the group at this time, or just we all love you?
Just when it's time for the primary, before you gotta get out the vote. call libertarians and basically where there's a primary and go out there and vote.
That'll be 8 May, and you guys will see emails and everything else, but it really is important. There's a lot of people in Wake who've invested a lot of time, and a lot of you are investing time and effort, and we certainly want to make sure Barbara is. Yes, and Barbara's definitely going to have to be victorious on 8 May.
Although Barbara has never lost a primary.
That's true.
Yes, and that will never happen as long as I am on. So anyway, any questions, comments, concerns? The April convention is going to be a lot of fun. We'll also have an open mic moment or two. So those of you who have issues you want to bring up, we'll, you know, look, it's libertarians. I definitely want everybody to have their opportunity to throw out whatever they need to throw out. It is a libertarian convention, and it wouldn't be one if we didn't have that moment. So with that in mind, thank you again, Mr. Sanders, for speaking. We enjoyed hosting you, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.